Hello and welcome to Homeland Security Today's 20th commemoration of the events of 9/11. Thank you for joining us for our epic series with numerous contributors from across America who have spent their careers working in the field of Homeland Security. We're extremely proud to have over 50 of the nation's luminaries writing and talking with us about the state of Homeland Security. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. David Gartenstein-Ross, who is known around the globe as a rising star in the counterterrorism community. And this may have been a few years ago, but Dr. Gartenstein-Ross has been advising Congress. He is the CEO and founder of Valens Global. He is a senior advisor on asymmetric warfare at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and an associate fellow at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism at the Hague. He is also an author who's written Bin Laden's Legacy, Why We're Still Losing the War on Terror, and that was 10 years ago, is that correct? Yes. 10 years ago. Yes, and also in 2019, he worked with the Secretary of Homeland Security and DHS to craft the Department of Homeland Security's strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence. So with that, I wanted to welcome you to this commemoration and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Christina. It's an honor to join you, and thanks for putting together such a valuable symposium of contributors to reflect on where we are.
It's been an honor. It's been an honor to work with everyone and see the thoughtful contributions so that we can make the next 20 years as effective as possible. So I'd love to ask you a few questions so we can advise, our policymakers and certainly educate the public more on what's going on in counterterrorism and terrorism around the globe and certainly domestically, because that's what I think you've been most outspoken about for the last several years. But 10 years ago, your outlook on how the US was doing in the war on terror was noticeably more pessimistic than virtually all of the public commentary on counterterrorism and terrorism. And you published the book on Bin Laden's Legacy. And that generated a great deal of discussion. In 2021, most public commentary on the war on terror is noticeably more pessimistic than it was when you published those pieces. So given this is a State of the Union, that we asked everyone to kind of provide a State of the Union on Homeland Security, my first question just has to be, how are we doing? And what is the state of our Homeland Security?
The answer there would continue to be a negative, but given the turn of public commentary to being more pessimistic, I think it's important to be a little bit more forward-looking. Things tend to go in cycles, and to me, I think it's always important to try to see what is being missed from public discussion. The reasons I'd say that right now the state of Homeland Security is more on the negative side, there are 5 factors I would look at. One is Afghanistan. A disaster there will translate into an increasing transnational terrorist threat. The second is a diversified violent extremist threat at home, especially on the far right, but you also have violent extremism on the far left as well. And then you have cases of what I called a few years ago, fringe fluidity. This is increasing, where you have sort of a mashup of different ideological strains that drive violence that don't fall within the traditional violent extremism categories as we would have defined them, say, even 15 years ago or so. The third thing that is important is mass shootings, which have continued to increase even during the pandemic. And then looking at the broad Homeland Security problem set, and not just at my own areas of expertise, you have an ongoing crisis at the US's southern border, which is part of the Homeland Security mission. And then fifth, another part of the Homeland Security mission deals with natural disasters, and we're grappling with the effects of climate change in the US with wildfire, flooding, drought. All of these produce an outlook that is negative on the whole. But so it's not to just kind of leave us with pessimism, because I think that raw pessimism doesn't help anybody. I want to try to extract a few lessons at the outset. One of them is in my view, the global war on terror as it was actually ended more than a decade ago. I think it ended in June of 2010 when Stanley McChrystal was removed from command in Afghanistan. At that point, our fight against terrorism became something very different than it was before. And it was never the same kind of priority based on the same kind of mission that emerged in 2001. It has its own mistakes and its own things that it got right. But I think it's a very different mission. And I point to that because a lot of the current commentary is very totalizing, as though we've been fighting GWOT for 20 years. And I don't think that's correct. So in the past 10 years, I think we've had somewhat greater kinetic success, though often with second order consequences that have been devastating in their own right. So one thing that I think will be regarded as a success in the future is the war that was fought against ISIS in Iraq and Syria from 2014 until about 2017. At the time, hopefully everyone recalls, ISIS was in the midst of controlling territory around the size of Great Britain. It was committing genocide against a religious minority group, the Yazidis. And it was largely that genocide, along with a few other ISIS actions, including the beheadings of American citizens, that provoked a US intervention at a time when the US definitely wanted to stay out of Iraq and Syria. I think the war against ISIS, though ISIS is resilient, and at some point will emerge, I think, in Iraq and Syria as a continuing challenge. It was largely successful in that period. There was no prolonged occupation that followed it. Also, there's the war in Libya. I've argued that the war in Libya was not successful. I think 10 years after we launched that war, my viewpoint is probably the one that most people would hold, because there was not a strategic interest there, and it's left behind basically another failed state in which jihadists can prosper. However, Libya was an intervention in which the US basically intervened from the air. It didn't occupy thereafter. I think there is a number of powerful lessons to be drawn from the Libya intervention, including, I think, at the outset, the US underestimated jihadist presence in Libya. I think if we had correctly assessed the chance of militancy rising in Libya, we would have been far more hesitant to intervene. And then a second lesson is you always need to link any sort of military intervention, especially those that risk destabilization, to a concrete national interest, which I do not think we had in Libya. A few other lessons I would draw, and I'll go through them quickly because I know that we have a long conversation to follow, but I've seen a lot of analytic errors, including over the impact of the Arab Spring. If you go back 10 years, one of the reasons that my view on where we were was noticeably more pessimistic than most was there was still a view back in September of 2011 that the Arab Spring was going to spell the end of groups like Al-Qaeda. That proved not to be the case. In fact, the regional instability ended up providing more fuel to militant movements than it had ever had before. But that was something that was a clear analytic error. I think there was another clear error about the impact of ISIS's rise on Al-Qaeda. Going back to the 2014 to 2017 period, it was very common for commentators, expert commentators, to say that ISIS was likely to result in the breakup of Al-Qaeda, that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or Shabab in Somalia could go over to ISIS. None of that happened. Al-Qaeda's core network has remained intact, and that represents a bit of a misreading. The reason why I focus on analytical errors is not just that my own primary work has been as an analyst, but also because if you're not assessing the world correctly, then it's going to be very difficult to make the right policy decisions. I guess two other things I throw out at the end are that the US government has a lot of trouble in formulating, implementing, and executing strategy. That becomes more important the further we get into the 21st century, because threats and challenges tend to move at a much greater speed than before, and the government needs to be able to react decisively. It's not clear to me that the government is well positioned to do so with respect to almost any challenge we confront, with a few exceptions. Finally, solutions should be scalable. And I think that's a lesson that actually has been fairly well ingrained. And especially with the technological environment that we're in, I believe that while technology does help threat actors, there also are important ways that the US government and actors seeking to build resiliency can use technology to confront a lot of major 21st century challenges.
Well, that's a great segue kind of into a discussion of what our leadership or what our policymakers are really missing and what questions they should be asking. I know that the US has kind of gone away from the pragmatic approach, more for a political discussion of many of these important topics. So from your perspective, what should they be focused on and what questions should they be asking to incorporate our lessons from the last 10 years?
So that's a great beginning point, right? You talked about in your question how we've become less pragmatic and more political. I think one critical question that all leaders should be asking is, how do we reduce polarization? You know, there's a lot of things that are driving polarization. I think more than anything, polarization is driven by two factors. One of them is the information environment that we're in, which has had profound effects, including the average politician has drifted away from the middle. When politicians were competing for the center, you had a little bit more of a basis of discussion or common ground. As politics has tended to drift towards the extremes, we have less of a center in our politics. This is not to say that all politicians should be in the center. I think that there's a benefit to having new ideas that are outside of the box. But the current level of polarization and the Twitterization of politics and everything becoming a partisan issue immediately is not helpful to us as a country, especially when we have big and very real challenges that confront us. A second thing is the magnitude of some of the problems that we confront and the way in which they've grown over time, including climate change, the erosion of the middle class, other issues that are very big and deeply held. I think that when it seems that mainstream politics doesn't have a solution, then you'll inevitably enter into a period of greater polarization. Nonetheless, I think that it's important to reduce polarization to be able to confront the challenges that we face. And even politicians who benefit from polarization in some ways, I think, feel threatened by it in other ways. I don't think anybody really likes the information environment in the world that we're in which you instantly hear all the reasons everybody in the world hates you. I don't think that that's good even for people who are superstars within this environment. Second thing is executing strategy. The second thing that leaders should be asking. They should ask, why does the US government have so much trouble executing strategy? And what changes can be made to empower both better strategic thinking and better execution? A lot of the commentary that I read right now about GWAT, I think, looks at it through a particular lens that's missing this bigger question. Often, the commentary is like, we made this decision poorly and this decision poorly and this decision poorly. But I think a much better question is, who is empowered to make or influence those decisions? How was the implementation? And why didn't course correction come earlier? So when I was writing Bin Laden's Legacy, I didn't actually get into this for the book because I realized how complex the question was. But in every set of interviews I had, I would ask, how do we empower better strategic thinking? What was interesting to me was that nobody had an answer to that, right? Like, because I talked to a lot of very brilliant people, both inside and outside of US government, and nobody could really answer within even their own agency the question of how do you empower better strategic thinking. It strikes me that this is a very important question, and for all of the numerous working groups that we have dealing with defense issues and homeland security issues, this is actually an issue that is extraordinarily under-theorized, where I don't think I know I don't have the answer, but I know that having an answer is extremely important to the future of our country and to the future of our homeland security. And a third question I think that policymakers should ask is, have the assessments that they have gotten of militant groups matched the reality? The reason why is, in dealing with militant groups, we're often trying to infer what can't be seen based on what can be seen. That's one reason why I think that circa 2011, a lot of assessments of the impact of the Arab Spring were wrong, because they were wrong about what was under the hood. They were wrong about the state of militant groups and their ability to mobilize and their ability to adapt. In 2021, we're still dealing with organizations that are primarily clandestine. And you have, a set of very competing views, for example, about what the Taliban will do when it governs Afghanistan. Is it a new Taliban? Will it break from Al-Qaeda? Will it rejoin Al-Qaeda? Will it continue to have a strong relationship with Al-Qaeda? These are important questions. I think it's very important that we keep track of how analysts do. Overall, whether you're a good analyst or a bad analyst is determined simply by, are you explaining the world correctly? It's not determined by how many retweets or likes you get. And so being able to keep track of analytic records, and I think making people make more falsifiable claims where they'll be proven right or wrong is important. It's a good way of assessing whether people are making correct inferences about what can't be seen. I know that at Valens Global, at my company, we place a premium on ensuring that we're tracking our analytic records so that if one of our assumptions is wrong, we can adjust quickly. I don't think on the whole analysts adjust quickly. I think on the whole, you tend to have a lot of doubling down before people will finally admit error. And I think and we can't afford that if it's influencing policy, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And that kind of makes me ask you a question that's not quite on our agenda, but that is when really our leadership and our direction is pushed by social media and public opinion on a very, I'm going to call it a low level of public opinion, because many people who tweet and retweet are certainly already doubling down on what they think to be true. So they share what they think to be true when it agrees with them. When that starts influencing our actual policy, it's hard enough to turn the Titanic. But to turn the Titanic every 4 years, for example, is even tougher. Do you have any suggestions on how we maintain course? Remain agile, but make sure that agility is based on fact and good information rather than politics?
Systemically, I think we should actually consider longer terms. I'm not convinced that, for example, for the House of Representatives, that it makes any sense to have an election once every 2 years. It means that basically, every single member of the House of Representatives is essentially in campaign mode all the time. I think that we need longer term thinking to address many of our current challenges. I'd consider lengthening the term in the House of Representatives to 3 years or even 4 years. Similarly, I'd consider lengthening the term of a presidency, perhaps to 5 years. I wouldn't want to make it much longer than that. In part, I just, it's been a while since we had a president that I'd like to see in office more than like a week. I think senators, I wouldn't want to lengthen it much beyond 6 years, but I think getting us away from a situation where people are constantly in campaign mode would be very healthy, and it might allow a reduction in polarization. Secondly, use of the information environment, I think, has never been constant. It's always fluctuated. So 10 years ago, I was an early adopter of social media. I think I started in on Twitter around 2008. But even 10 years ago, 2011, Twitter was a place I enjoyed. I spend barely any time there these days, but that's in part because running and scaling a business is a lot of work, and I can't really justify taking time out from my day-to-day to tweet that much. But the way we use any sort of information technology fluctuates. Right now, it's extraordinarily tribalistic and extraordinarily polarized with a lot of echo chambers. I think that's, you've had a long-term trend in that direction. There's no question about that. Even, circa, I think, 2004, Cass Sunstein came out with a book making this exact argument. But people don't have to adopt the norms or the mores of the platform that they're utilizing. I think especially there are two things which I think are important for anybody who's engaging in social media. One is decision fatigue. If you understand decision fatigue, I think an extraordinary amount of brain power and decisions are wasted on social media and wasted on kind of the decision of, do I tweet this? What's a good snappy comeback to this point that my adversary is making? Ultimately, given the scale of world challenges we're facing, we're just not going to tweet our way out of those challenges. And so probably using it a little more sparingly would be good for people who actually feel like they're part of a cognizable solution set. The second thing is the dopamine effect, which I think is much more insidious. Basically, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It provides a reward function. And platforms like Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms very purposefully hijack our dopamine. When you get retweets, likes on Facebook, shares, this can produce a dopamine effect. And to me, a lot of times when I look at the medium, it's very clear that people, like, what they're saying is geared simply towards attempts to get attention, attempts to gain popularity or to gain views, rather than to really contribute something. Almost any snark or quip, is an attempt to get some amplification from someone else. And that's negative for a few reasons. I mean, just generally, people should not like having their brain chemistry hijacked. But also, there's a danger in being so dependent upon external validation. Oftentimes, to get the right answer, you need to step outside of the herd as opposed to doubling down on your tribal identity. Those are things about how we use it. But in terms of what can be done writ large, in addition to perhaps lengthening term limits, I'd say that as currents tend to produce countercurrents, reactions tend to any sort of action tends to produce a reaction. Reactions tend to produce counter reactions, and I think cyclically the area where we're going is, at some point, the current kind of hyper-partisanship and cheap shots will have a reaction to it. And I think that part of the reaction, we can see a little bit of a move to try to strengthen the center, right? We can see small signs of that. But in both 2016 and 2020, you had musings about kind of third parties in national politics. Ben Sass of Nebraska began that discussion in 2016 with some public musings that got a lot of attention. If you look at New York City and the mayoral race there, you have Andrew Yang, who got a lot of attention in the 2020 primaries for forming a third party. I think there'll be a move to form a third party. And I think there's a very natural space in the center of American politics. Whether that will save our politics is its own question, but that's something I would look to as being perhaps productive. I think people want answers. right? And ultimately, people are going to understand that the hyper-partisan environment that we're in and the name calling isn't advancing us towards a solution or advancing us towards a better country.
Completely agreed. And I think I could talk about this with you all day, but we really want to get some of your input so that we can position better. And so I want to bring us back to the withdrawal in Afghanistan and just ask you about how you believe we will realign both our budget and our policy priorities based on that withdrawal. I mean, there was a lot of criticism of the length of the war and how much it cost every year. And now that that withdrawal has happened, how will we reassess and reorient?
I'd say it's not clear to me that the reorientation is going to occur within the same set of budgets. So look, at some point, we need to start paying down our debt, right? If you look at the amount of money that we're spending to pay for interest on the debt year to year, it's taking up an increasing amount of, for example, the defense budget. So at some point, we're going to have to stop deficit spending, as we've been doing for a long time. And that's going to be an expensive reorientation. Secondly, even within the Homeland Security budget, I think you're already seeing a repositioning of money for dealing with climate-related challenges, for dealing with wildfires, flooding, drought. And that's going to be an increasing amount of our budget, at least until kind of major structural or tech or systemic fixes are in place. In terms of the threat of terrorism, I think that there's a few different areas where we'll see spending focused. The term over-the-horizon capabilities has kind of come into vogue lately. I'd be interested in actually seeing a good description of why we started using that term and when, but at any rate, like over-the-horizon capabilities would be one set of capabilities that we invest in. Secondly, domestically, the attempts to address domestic violent extremism are going to be increasingly important. I think most observers underestimate the degree to which the government has already been invested in them for the past several years. I would say that especially if you look at what the FBI has focused on, it hasn't been as absent from domestic terrorism issues as a lot of people believe. But at any rate, domestic terrorism is going to be an important area where we now have, as you mentioned, I played a key role in putting together DHS's 2019 strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence. I think there's very much a straight line between that document and the 2021 National Security Council domestic terrorism strategy. I got to speak to the author of that strategy, and he agrees that there's a lot of continuity between those two documents. And that's positive, right? You actually want there to be a little bit more of a administration to administration continuity, because dealing with issues like terrorism, you'd like to have various administrations of different ideological stripes essentially on the same page. But anyway, despite kind of the DHS strategy, despite the NSC strategy, I think there's a lot there that still hasn't been worked out. I think that domestic terrorism is already somewhat politicized, and I think it's likely that politicization will increase in that area. And I think there's a lot of danger there. There's a lot that will need to be worked out with respect to DT, but at any rate, I think that will be an increasing priority. Third, I think that prevention is going to be an increasing priority. We can already see an increase in US government spending vis-a-vis prevention. And a fourth thing, in terms of, I'm not sure we'll see increased spending in this regard, but if post-Afghanistan we have a rising international terrorist threat, as I think we will, not just based on Afghanistan, but based on a number of other countries where jihadist organizations essentially have free reign to operate, at least to some extent, then we're going to see border security and pushing out our borders as important. I think we already have a lot that's in place there, but I think that's another area that we're going to probably look to as being critical to U.S. Homeland Security efforts.
So you took Afghanistan and certainly moved into the issue of domestic terrorism, and 50% of the country believes January 6th was a non-event, and the other 50% believes it was the beginning of the unraveling of our democracy. So we have a great divide in opinion on January 6th, which was, truly a monumental event. It was certainly a turning point in how we look at people who are protesting current government policy. But other people are saying that we're in the midst of or entering kind of an age of extremism. What do you think is driving this? Is that accurate? Is it just an age of extremism? And how do we kind of either extricate ourselves from it or manage it?
First thing I'll say is that extremism itself isn't necessarily bad. I think that's one of the reasons why the term violent extremism has come into vogue. That idea, it's good to have extreme ideas, depending on what the prevalent view in any given era is. In Galileo's time, his views of astronomy were very much extreme and outliers and were punished. If you go back, say 20, 30 years, having a somewhat more extreme view, if we had a somewhat more extreme or non-mainstream view of what to do about climate change, we might have less severe impacts in that regard. So extremism isn't necessarily bad. It can be good. I think violent extremism is something that should be out of bounds, in part because violent extremism holds that not only do you have non-mainstream views, but that you can impose your views on others by force, that it's justifiable to kill or harm someone who doesn't agree with you. So not only are your views extreme in some way, but you also believe that you're judge, jury, and executioner in imposing them. That is inherently a problem. A lot of things are driving this. A few of them I talked about before. There's the information environment that we're in. There's the monumental challenges that we confront and people's view that we're just not making sufficient progress fast enough in dealing with them, along with probably kind of this view towards easy answers, right? Like a lot of the challenges that we confront are truly difficult to get solutions to, at least within the constraints that we have bureaucratically and technologically. The easier they seem, the easier the answer seems, the more prone we are to conspiratorial thinking of some kind, where there's some shadowy sect or that may be blocking our ability to deal with it. In terms of how we extricate ourselves from an age of extremism, I think extremism, and particularly violent extremism, whether from non-state actors or from the state, as during the era of Nazi Germany and the fascist movements, or the Soviet Union, violent extremism tends to be driven by hard times. People are less prone to violent extremism when they have hope. The level of hope within a society tends to fluctuate over time. Societies tend to go through hard periods, they tend to go through easy periods, and oftentimes it's unexpected how we do so. Meaning that oftentimes when we're at a period of greatest pessimism, optimism might be on the horizon. But I think more than anything, this relates to what we were talking about in terms of hyperpartisanship. We can try to arrest or de-radicalize or off-ramp or prevent our way to a solution. And that's part of what we need to do. But ultimately, people need hope. And hope doesn't spring from ridiculing the other side or making people feel unsafe on Twitter or anytime they appear in public. Like, ultimately, hope comes from building a better society. To me, that's going to be part of the solution to extremism. That ultimately, degree of extremism is linked to the question of how optimistic do we feel about our tomorrow? How optimistic do we feel about where we'll be in 5, 10, 15 years? Extremism is linked to feeling like you don't have an opportunity to be heard. I think there's plenty of people who feel that they do not have an opportunity to be heard. And in fact, oftentimes you have this dynamic of what we call reciprocal radicalization, where different factions with somewhat extreme views are antagonizing one another, making one another delve into ever greater into polarized or extreme positions. That's the dynamic of where we are. Ultimately, extricating ourselves from this solution, it's something where we're all players. And I'd say that the obligation falls on all of us to try to do better.
I couldn't agree more. And there are many of foreign state actors who are also playing us one another against each other and increasing that radicalization. And thankfully, we have other contributors who are also discussing the narrative warfare and the ways that our adversaries are leveraging our divided we fall mentality right now. So I completely agree, but it's very, very difficult to manage the meta messaging with all the micro, with all the Twitter. So yeah, it's a huge, huge challenge that's facing us. I know we're kind of running out of time, so I think I would love to end on a little bit about your forthcoming book, and it's examining jihadist groups' learning processes. And so why did you decide to pick that topic? And how should this book and your observations inform our efforts to counterterrorism? And please tell us when it'll be out so we can have an interview with you about it then as well.
Thanks, Christina. I will definitely let you know as it's coming out. It'll be out some point in 2022. I'm not sure if a publication date has been set yet. One thing I realized after years working in this field was that organizational learning is very much understudied and underappreciated. There have been a few very good contributions in this regard. There have been a few books written and a decent symposium in studies in conflict and terrorism, but it's a topic which I think we continue to underestimate. Really, it was founding Valens and seeing what I could do with an organization that gave me a deeper appreciation for what the adversary does with organizations. The 21st century is defined more than anything by pace of change. I think I think everybody can understand this. There's a great quote by Ray Kurzweil that I have used in a few different reports that I've written. This was Kurzweil, who's a famed futurist, talking at the turn of the 20th century. And he argued that we would have a 20th century's worth of change in the first 14 years of the 21st century, then another 20th century's worth of change in the next 7 years. In other words, by this year, by 2021, there would have been two 20th centuries worth of change. I think that's actually accurate observationally, though, going back and running the numbers and figuring out whether Kurzweil got it exactly right would be mind-bogglingly complex. But he's pointed to a very real factor, which is exponential pace of change. So when we look at adversaries, part of their ability to succeed is going to rest in their ability to learn, whether with respect to technologies or strategies or tactics. And this book, which I think will be, unless something goes horribly wrong, this should be the last book I write about jihadist terrorism. I wanted to conclude by really looking at this factor that has driven so much of jihadist groups' actions and outlook over the past 3 to 4 decades. So to me, it's an important swan song, and one that gets to something that we should be thinking about with the range of actors that we confront, but especially non-state actors, which is how do they engage in learning? If we understand how they learn, and if we are able to have in mind their learning processes, their centers of learning, who within an organization impedes their learning, who helps their learning, then we'll be more effective at combating militant organizations.
Well, I hope that this being your swan song book just means that you're going to write books about another topic instead of stopping altogether. But we look forward to learning more about that. And that is just a critical part as we're seeing about a lot of our adversaries, China, Russia, terrorists, certainly how they're learning and how they're adapting to their own weaknesses and vulnerabilities in order to maintain their position is fascinating. And so very happy to hear you're tackling that topic. So I want to thank you for your time with us today. We also are very excited to announce that you have joined our editorial board. So we'll be hearing from you more in the future, and we appreciate that very much. We look forward to your future work, and certainly thank you for your time today. Thank you all for joining us for this State of the Union series in the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Please do log on to hstoday.us, our 9/11 commemoration, to see more of the contributors and what they've written. And also, we really encourage you to take a look at the charities that are still coping with the effects of 9/11 and make a contribution. So we have 3 that we're featuring, and we encourage you to take a look and make a donation to any charity that's working still to reduce the impacts of the events of 9/11. Thank you all for being part of the Homeland Security community, and thank you for what you do every day. Have a wonderful one, and we'll see you soon at hstoday.us.